this really is kind of part two of our Glory and Grace series. So Michael kicked it off last week and I wasn't here, but I got to watch the video of it. Absolutely amazing message. And if you haven't listened to that or you weren't here, do listen to it again. But thank you, and really appreciated the time, the effort, the wisdom, the revelation you put into that as well. And so we're going to keep looking at this topic of glory and grace. Now, John, when he writes the book of John, is revealing the glory and grace of Jesus. He starts in that passage of John 1 with this incredible portrait of who Jesus is, Jesus revealed, as this almighty, incredible, glorious being. But John is really actually just describing Jesus all the way through the book. It's my favorite gospel. It's, for me, the one that's most intimate. It's the one that just makes me long to know Jesus more. It just portrays him as all these different ways. And what John's really trying to get us to see here is that there is somebody greater than we could ever possibly have imagined that has arrived. And so we get this John 1 portrait, but then we see that Jesus is greater than Moses. We see that Jesus is greater than the temple. And when we dive into this story of the woman at the well, we see that Jesus is greater than the forefathers of Jacob. He's greater than the temple. He's greater than any religious barriers. We saw it in the story just before this, that Jesus turns water into wine, that Jesus makes greater wine, right? He does greater things. And so John is really trying to show us who this Messiah is, full of glory and full of grace. And as Michael so beautifully put it last week, we have to understand both together. We have to understand the glory of who God is revealed in Jesus. And we have to understand the grace that he has for us that enables us to experience the glory. And as his glory fills us, he fills us with his grace so that we can show his grace and glory to others. It's this unbelievable kind of, you can hardly get your head around it. But there's so much of his glory to experience, so much of his grace to experience. And the purpose of these messages is just that somehow, through the scriptures, through our conversation, we'd be drawn deeper to Jesus and go, show me your glory. I want to see you. I want to behold you. And as Michael says, we behold him, we become like him. His glory fills us, and then his glory leaks through us with the grace of God to the people around us, and they have their own testimony and story to tell. And so what I love about this story here is a number of factors in it. But the first one is this story, the woman at the well, isn't really about the woman at the well. This is a story about what God really looks like and what he's really like. You see, it busts open every false concept we've got of what God is like. You see, when you see Jesus walk up to that well, as Jerry said, there's this intent. He's at that well at that time with one thing on his heart, one person on his heart, and everything he's doing is intentional to meet that lady, to show that radical grace and divine acceptance for her, and to set her free, and to set her voice free. It's the most beautiful thing. And it shows us that God is so full of grace, that he's so radically loving, that he would do that for one person. Now, we know that theologically, but when you see it in a story like that, it kind of blows your mind, because this isn't a distant God. This isn't an angry God. This isn't a judging God. This isn't a God with a checklist of sins. This isn't a God who's dividing and separating the righteous and the unrighteous. This is a God who is radically looking out and loving and reaching his hand out to the one. That blows my mind every time I read it, because this shows us what God is like. Well, the second thing it teaches us really is about the woman. And I think you've covered all of this in your own revelations, that this woman was a Samaritan. So Samaritans were seen as unclean. They were supposed to stay separate. They weren't supposed to mix with Jews. Salvation was coming through the Jews, not through the Samaritans. So the Samaritans really had no way to receive salvation. They weren't allowed in the temple. They couldn't worship in the temple, the place that God's presence was meant to be. And so she is separate, regardless of any other factor, just as a Samaritan. So number one, she's a Samaritan. Number two, she's a woman. And women in this day and age were not treated well, were looked down upon, were supposed to not meet singularly with men. That would have been seen to be not right. And this woman, who's a Samaritan, who's a woman, we find out has had 5 husbands. And so to the Jews, again, this would have meant that she was unrighteous, she was a sinner. But not only the Jews, but it was clear from the story that the fact that she was at the well at the 6th hour. Now, bear in mind that in those days they didn't have Apple Watches. My understanding is they didn't even have sundials until a little bit later. So they used a system of, the 12th hour, the 3rd hour, the 6th hour as a rough measure of time to say this is the time period on which this happened. Can you imagine living your life without a watch? It's like, what time do you get to work? Well, somewhere between the 1st and 6th hour. I don't know how it works. But at this particular time, what we know, it was the afternoon, and therefore it's likely to be hot. So she's coming to this well for water on her own, and we believe that the reason she's on her own and doing it in the heat of the day, because the normal practice would have been to come early in the morning. So this suggests that she's an outcast. This suggests that others don't want to be with her. This suggests that she's pretty lonely. This suggests that her voice is not being heard. This suggests that this woman is living with a lot of pain. And so it's in this moment that she comes to the well, and it's in this moment that Jesus chooses to meet her there. And I find that staggering, because this woman, her world is about to change from where she's at to what's about to happen because of this encounter with Jesus. Now, clearly she's thirsty, and that's why she's come to get water. It's in the heat of the day, so she's going to be even thirstier. But as we saw earlier, she actually leaves the water because something else happens that's more important for her than the water that she came to get. So here's this woman that nobody else really wants to know. We don't really know what she's been through. But I love the way that chosen clip kind of shows some of that. If you think of anybody you know that's had a number of relationships, in every relationship there will be pain. And where there's a broken relationship and a new one, there's likely to be unforgiveness, there's likely to be trauma. If you're a woman, there's likely to be abuse having happened in that scenario as well. Then there's the social impact of that, of being ignored or being rejected. This woman's experience of men, quite frankly, was probably shocking. So she comes to the well, and there's a lone man who she shouldn't be talking to. Now, I want to suggest to you that this woman has probably never met a man whose gaze is 100% pure. I want to suggest that perhaps when she met Jesus, she saw in his eyes somebody who simply didn't need anything from her other than her devotion, as Joe said. He didn't need anything from her sexually. He didn't need any favors from her. He didn't try to manipulate her. He wasn't trying to get anything from her. All of her experience of men was totally, radically different to her experience of Jesus. Because he is pure, he was able to give her pure water. Because his heart was pure, he could talk and speak to her heart. Because he had no evil desires in his heart, he was able to give her something rather than seeking to take something from her. And so for the first time in her life, perhaps, she meets a man who can set her free rather than bring her into captive. Isn't that incredible? That's what's going on in this story. It's utterly stunning. And I don't know, I just pray for that level of purity for us. That level of purity where even in societal norms that say you shouldn't be alone with a woman, and I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. The thing with Jesus, he was so pure he could be alone with a woman. The only thing that was at risk for him was his reputation, because his heart and his behavior and his eyes were not at risk. Isn't that staggering? So that's what I see here. And this woman, when she meets him, she has a conversation with him. We don't know her name. It's like she's the nameless one. And yet we know that Jesus knows her name. Not because he uses it in the story, but because she said, he told me everything about my life, everything I ever did. So we know that Jesus knew who she was. And the fact that nobody else knew who she was, the fact that we don't know who she was, the fact that other people didn't want to know who she was or even to be with her was transformed in a moment because Jesus wanted to be with her. And it's the same for us, right? Sometimes we might feel that people don't know our name, that people don't really want to be with us. We might feel rejected. We might feel ostracized, judged for our past or our present or our faith. But in the midst of all of that, Jesus sits with her in the midst of the heat of the day. So this story tells us a lot about who God is revealed fully in Jesus. It tells us about this woman. And it's super easy to read a story like this and go, yeah, it's that woman. But as I read this last couple of weeks, the thing that really struck me was this. I'm that woman. That's me. That's us. We're the woman. We are the ones that have a checkered history, a past. We're the ones that have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. I've done that. We're the ones that have felt alone and rejected. We're the ones that have perhaps had relationships that didn't work, and we're the ones that have got perhaps some bitterness in our hearts or some people we haven't forgiven, but we have now because we did it this morning. But we're the one. We're the woman. And the way that Jesus approaches the woman at the well is exactly what he does for us. He comes out to seek and save the lost. He goes out to look for people. He goes out to wait for them. And he did exactly that for us. He looked for us. He knew us. He saw us. He saw our guilt. He saw our shame. And yet he doesn't come to condemn. Jesus didn't come to condemn the world, but he came to set us free. He came to meet us heart to heart, face to face, to transform us, to release us and send us out. And it's so important to see this because when we see that we're the woman, it changes the way that we judge the people that perhaps we think aren't deserving or aren't good enough or haven't done enough or are living in sin or doing whatever. Because there are people like this woman and like us all around us, right? And if we're going to represent the heart of God, we have to look like God. And that means we look like Jesus, who's full of glory and full of grace. And he comes to reveal himself as the Messiah, the anointed King, full of glory. But his glory is revealed in his radical acceptance and grace at the well. See, even the well points to Jesus. Because every well that was dug in the Old Testament was dug as a way of blessing. It was part of a covenant promise from God. It was part of blessing the people, the family, the livestock, and the people to come. It was a marker of God's blessing. But the well points to the living water, who is Jesus. And so Jesus comes with living water, and we too need to be filled with this living water. So that as we go, we point people to Jesus and they encounter the grace of God. But unless we see ourselves as the woman and realize just how in need we are of him, just how much we've been forgiven of, it's very hard for us to see the people around us and not become religious, not step into pride, right? Because we go, well, I don't do that. I don't live like that. I read my Bible. I go to church. And very quickly we place ourselves on a pedestal. And when we place ourselves on a pedestal, what do? We become arrogant. We look down on people. In this story, there's not a single example of Jesus looking down on this woman. He sits so that he's lower than her. He asks her for a drink because he wants to receive her devotion. He speaks to her not as a Samaritan, not merely as a woman, not someone who's had 5 marriages, but he speaks to her as someone who he loves radically and who he wants to have relationship with. Now, if Jesus, the King of Glory, can do that, my prayer is that I'll be able to do that. That there will be nobody that I can't love in that way, no matter what they've done and who they are, that the grace of God isn't enough to flow through our lives to those people. Because as soon as we put ourselves above people, as soon as we begin to judge people, what happens is we actually start to to close our heart towards them, and in response, their heart towards us. And there is no heart-to-heart exchange of living water. See, when people come to us or we meet them, we want them to have living water, not any other kind of water, not water that is impure, water that is bitter, or water that is full of judgment. Because there's none of that in this story. There's just the pure living water of who Jesus is. And so that's what we need. So we've looked at that. This shows us who God is. It shows who this woman was. It shows us actually who we are. And this story goes on because this woman's life is so radically transformed. And I love what you said, Dimi, about the prophetic in there, because up until that point, there's a conversation, there's a discussion about temples and mountains and worship and water. And it's full of spiritual truths relating to practical truths. And that's often the way the Lord speaks in these things. But there's a moment there where he looks in her eyes and he calls out her history and her past in such a way that she cannot deny that he knows her. And that's when his heart and her heart becomes connected and it unlocks something. Now, there's two truths here, right? One is that he knows everything about us, right? So when we try and hide stuff and pretend it hasn't happened or don't talk to him about it, I think he just chuckles. He's like, have you forgotten who I am? I know, I see, right? But he never does it with judgment, and he never does it to condemn. He doesn't want us to sit in our sin. He doesn't want us to stay in our sin. He wants us to be free of it. But he doesn't condemn her. So that's number one. The second thing in this, which I think is remarkable about the prophetic, is that unlocking, that knowing, does something which makes her realize that this is actually the Messiah. And there's something about when we reach out to people around us, that when we demonstrate as well as proclaim the kingdom of God, it does something in people's hearts. You see, the glory of Jesus is revealed in miracles. He reveals himself in a miracle. In his first miracle in turning the water into wine, it says that his glory was revealed. So when Jesus sovereignly heals people, when people come to faith and they experience salvation, when people are delivered, it points to Jesus and reveals his glory. And we're told to eagerly desire spiritual gifts, especially the gift of prophecy. And one of the reasons is that when prophecy is used, not just in the church, but when prophecy is used with those who don't yet know the Lord, it brings credibility, it unlocks something, enables people to receive something because they suddenly realize that they're known. And most people don't believe that they're known by anybody. They're longing to be known. And that's what happens in this story. And so this has left me with a deeper desire to move in more of the prophetic. And even this week, when we were away with Joe Moody, there was a lady that was just standing at the back. She had her eyes shut and her hands open, and I'd finished praying for all the people in the prayer line and seen the Lord heal some backs, some knees, seen this Muslim guy just encounter the Lord, and just this wonderful story that he told me of what God had done in his life. And I finished praying for these people, and I went over to this lady, and I just laid my hand very gently on her shoulder and began just to pray quietly, very quietly, just over her. And I felt the Lord gave me some scriptures for her, so I just shared those scriptures with her, and there were quite a few. And when I'd finished, she just opened her eyes and she looked at me and she said, thank you. She said, those are the scriptures that I'm pouring into this season and that I'm using in my job. And I was like, Lord, you're so kind, because it's him, right? He's the one that speaks to us. I'm just trying to be obedient to what he says and speaking that. And she's blessed by that. And I said, well, tell me, what do you do? And she says, well, I run a Pilates class, like a wellness Pilates class. My heart is to reach Muslim women in my community. And so they come to my Pilates class and I use these scriptures to encourage myself, but also these are the scriptures I use because I want these women to encounter Jesus. I said, well, that's amazing. I said, as you were talking, I feel like there is a woman at the well that you're going to meet. And so I shared a little bit more about that. And she turned to me and she said, she said, that's amazing. She said, the business, the ministry is called The Well. And I was like, Lord, you're so kind again. And she went away. She's already a believer, but I'm just giving you an example of how the prophetic moves from a conversation to somebody knowing that they're known. This lady left knowing that the Lord saw what she was doing. And in the midst of the pain, the struggle, the difficult things, wanting to see more, she left super encouraged because God had met her and spoken to her and showed that he knows exactly what is going on. And that's the power of the prophetic. It's the same in evangelism. If we're talking with people, the chap I said that I prayed for about the back and the knee, he told me this story that he was walking down a street one day just a few weeks ago, and his life was pretty tough, and he literally just said this out loud, but like quietly. He said, I just wish someone would just stop me and help me. So he said to himself as he's walking down the road. And then he walks past this group of people, one of which is Raj from Agape, who was here a couple of Sundays ago. And Raj saw him, and she went over to him, and she said, I'd love to talk to you about something like that. And he was like, whoa. And so she began to ask him who he was, began to share the gospel with him. This chap gave his life to Jesus. A week later, he got baptized. A week later, we meet him in church. He gets healed of a 10-year back problem where he was run over by a tractor, and healed, so his feet, not his knees, both feet were healed as well. You see, Jesus was looking for him, but it required someone to stop and prophesy over him to unlock. He was thirsty, but he didn't know where to go for a drink. So that's the other thing about this story. It reveals who Jesus is, that he's better, more radical, more glorious, more grace-filled than we ever realized. It shows us the impact he has on this incredible woman's life. It shows us that we are this woman in need of the same grace with no room for pride, that we are the one who radically accepted that Jesus looked for. But it also shows us that we also are sent in the same way as this lady goes out. This incredible woman actually becomes the first evangelist we read about in Scripture. So anybody ever struggles with women in leadership? Well, Jesus chose this woman to go and reach this whole town. So she's an evangelist, but she's also an apostle because she's a sent one. So she goes out and she brings all these people to come and see. Come and see this man who told me everything I ever did in my life. And they come out, and it says at the end of this passage that when they come out, they don't come out because they believe yet. They come out because of the power of this woman's testimony. And I suspect because of the joy and the freedom and the difference they're seeing in this woman, because this woman had no voice. Because of the broken relationships, the broken marriages, because of the fact that she was a woman, the fact that she was a Samaritan, the fact that she was rejected, the fact that she was alone and lonely, she had no voice. Jesus gives her voice back. And she uses that voice to go and tell everybody else about him. And then they all come and see. And then when they meet him and they hear, they also go, this is the Messiah. So I think that's the last thing that the Lord wants to show us this morning is who are the women at the well that the Lord is sending us to? Who are the people that are hurting, broken, but thirsty? People just like us. That the Lord wants to reveal his grace and his glory to, but he's sending us to them. And I want to be in a place where I'm so full of his presence and his love that when they meet me, they meet him. When they meet you, they meet him, right? So we as his body go out and reveal both the glory and the grace of Jesus. And that those people will become like people of peace. They would be the people that go back to their communities and say, come and see. Come and see. Come and meet this Jesus. Come and gather with this group of people from Selah. Come and hear what God is doing. Come and see the word and who this Jesus really is and how much he loves you. And their families and their lives and their communities begin to be transformed. Dimi said something to me this week at the prayer meeting. He said, do you know what? If each of us just did that with one person in a year, and I'm not saying we should limit it to one, but if we did it with one person, and then they did it with one person, and they did it with one person, the power of multiplication would sweep through our community. Now, we'd call that revival, right? But actually, it's simply stopping for the one at the well. Asking the Lord, who's thirsty? How do I bring your living water to them? How do I invite them to come and see? And how do they meet with you and see their lives changed and transformed? And there are people everywhere, in our workplaces, in our communities. Just 2 weeks ago, I was at the garden centre getting my car washed, ready to transport lots of people from America around the country. I wanted my car to be clean because it was stinky. And I was waiting to get in the garden centre, and there was about 20 minutes before it opened, and I was freezing. I didn't have a jumper on or anything because I thought it was going to be open to go and get a coffee. So I'm standing outside, I'm cold, I'm pacing around. And just before it opened, this lady came up, and she was waiting to go in, and I just began to talk to her. And I'm not going to tell you the whole story, but this lady told me that she had lost her husband 2 weeks ago. She was probably only in her 30s. She had a 4-year-old son. And as she told me this story, I just began to cry. And I knew it was God's compassion, not just mine. I knew it was his compassion for her. And we had a bit more of a conversation, and and so on, and that was fine. But I tell you that story because I don't think that was an accident. I don't think it was an accident that she was there and I was there at the same time. I don't think it was an accident that she told me what had happened. She didn't need to tell me what had happened. She could have kept that to herself. She never met me. She doesn't know me. I think that was a God thing. And I believe that God has got encounters for each of us, and encounters with people that are thirsty and hungry. And if we'll open our hearts and represent this God of glory and grace to them, he'll give us more and more and more, and he'll entrust us with more. So that's really the main message today, that this God of glory and grace has revealed himself most fully in Jesus Christ, and he is better than we can imagine, more radically accepting than we could possibly think of. And that just like that woman who is us, he knows you and me, he knows who we are, he knows what we've done, and yet he wants to be with us. And he enjoys being with us. And he has living water for us, both for our own salvation and eternal life, but also to dispense to the people around us.